And we're live.
Hello, everybody. We're back again with Dear Jackson helping to host the pathetic old man who's doing YouTubes. As usual, we're continuing our endless treatment of contested bones, and now we're coming up to a scary time. It's Halloween! So we get to find terrifying pseudo-scholarship by creationists and intelligent designers on creepy stick insects and the ENCODE project. This one was a really fun part on this. And well, of course, we'll also have to do a good catch up, everybody plug for where we're doing on the rocks for there. But anyway, I was delighted to see finally the genetic angle to see what the hell they were going to do about it. And I've kind of looked ahead in the chapter to see its technical references to Michael Sanford, co-author. Probably going to be really fun. Off with a bang. It was somebody that I had in my bibliography before, Dan Graur, but it was a quote: "If ENCODE is right, then evolution is wrong." Evolutionary geneticist Dan Graur of the University of Houston. And he actually goes out of his way to repeat this statement about it. In the words of one prominent evolutionist, if ENCODE is right, then evolution is wrong. I kind of doubted that about Dan Graur, so I had to type in the thing to get the linkage in that because it was a link to a website, and I put the link into it. It was a really nice 2013 lecture, or rather the PowerPoint that he was using for the lecture. So you would have to remember that what you were seeing on the screen in the various slides were the images that were up on the screen, and he'd be talking about stuff. It was painfully obvious where the evolution is wrong quote came from, when right next to it was a picture of Jonathan Wells's junk DNA book. He was criticizing that view. He made a great, Dan Graur was one of the co-authors of the paper that just ripped ENCODE to shreds at the time. And I put a link to it, by the way. And it actually was a delicious speech. If you ever want to, I would have loved to have heard the actual lecture that it was, because he had a ton of stuff. There were a couple of technical papers that I put a link to as well on where they were finding gene islands in the genome and removing them and finding out the mice it all. And it's all about the issue of just because something exists in the genome, it doesn't mean it's necessary for the organism to function. And therefore, it was a whole issue of what does this junk DNA mean and the difference between transcribed and translated. DNA thought it was good enough that I would put the link up on it. And plus, it touched on issues that you've dealt with and we deal with also, is about what genetic information means and how it doesn't really mean what a lot of people think it does. Graur, who, by the way, Rupe and Sanford misspell his name twice. They put an E in where it doesn't belong. And I suspect they didn't bother to go through the whole bloody PowerPoint lecture because it was just delightful. So, for example, he had one, slide number 21, where he gives the reasons, how did ENCODE get it so wrong? Where they were arguing that 80% of the human genome function, but only, or we can see only about 5% of it is operating in a selective context. So he had a bunch of these things. One, they were equating hype with science. Two, they were wrong experimental systems. They were relying on the HeLa human clone cells that aren't representative of human cells, and they were relying on cancer cells. So they were picking the wrong data field to play with. They used inappropriate statistical analyses. They had a peculiar definition of function, a peculiar definition of junk, a lack of evolutionary perspective, a lack of objectivity about the study of the organism, and an ignorance of everything that came before. Harder of a takedown. And it was particularly funny because there were sections that you and I are familiar with about what it means to be complex. And he points out that complexity doesn't correlate with chromosome or genome size or gene number. And one of the slides had up, I would have loved to have gotten a copy of it so I could put it up, but you can find it. It's slide 82. There's a picture of a bawling baby. And the caption is, "Mommy, mommy, a fern has 27 times as many chromosomes as I do. An amoeba has 200 times more DNA than I do. And wheat has 5 times more genes than me." Yeah, he's got a whole bunch of listings of all of this, to where all of that bit about what it means to be complex and what the DNA is just irrelevant. The take home that I got from the ENCODE, and it's fun because I now understand it better than I did previously. It was a really wonderful lecture just from those PowerPoint slides. Is that, of course, they're measuring something, but what is it they're measuring? So they've got a huge, wide measuring stick that's going to be capturing a whole bunch of transcription zones that are actually individual things. And so they're overestimating the number of things that are happening down there. And they're not really finding out whether or not they're doing anything in the cell. They're just kind of capturing the foam on the beer. So it was an absolutely delicious analysis. This is not a good way for this book to start when they absolutely misrepresent Graur's position. It's 180 degrees opposite from what they're implying it is, and are functionally channeling junk DNA, which is a really superficial book, by the way. I don't think they actually go to cite it because I'm amazed Behe pops up. Irrelevant on that front. Anyway, your thoughts about this?
Yeah, from we had it was Nathan Lentz on, wasn't it? And he said he was asked to do part of it or to participate in it, and he thought it was very weird even from the start. It's a very weird project.
Yeah. And Graur points out that both science and nature have kind of downplayed their characterization of it to maybe only 20% of the genes are falling in with this framework. But Graur rips them over the coals that this isn't even valid, that it's just a terribly inaccurate to deal with. And he made a particular bit about the enormous amount of hype, including explicitly mentioning creationists, and he puts various tags up to various creation bits. So it was terribly ironic for creationist Rupe and Sanford to be playing the quote hype game about a lecture that was criticizing quote hyping.
Well, that would require they actually read everything or listen to the whole thing, and
yeah,
well, you know.
Yeah, and this one, I mean, there's only 162 slides. There was no audio to it. So because I've done PowerPoints and that, you have to be very careful when extrapolating from PowerPoint slides, which may or may not references.
That's not bad for a lecture.
And there's a lot of commentary. Yeah, it was, and again, he listed specific details enough so that I could interpolate what was going on, and the fact that he was using humor so much. I could just spot the things where the audience would have just been roaring, especially with the crying baby thing. All of that stuff that are tropes in the creationist lexicon, where they think that just because we are more complicated, air quotes, than an amoeba, that therefore can tell that by gross measurements of how many chromosomes there are or what the DNA length is. No, that's not how biology at that level, and how gobsmackingly intricate the variations are. And the work that's now, you can give a thumbs up or down for this summary, but I'd say that what we now know over the last 5 or 10 years of science work in that area just blows away what had been done for the previous half century in terms of understanding what's going on at that deep origin of meiosis and sexual reproduction part.
Absolutely, yeah, it's pretty crazy. I read Nick Lane's book, The Vital Question. He talks a bit about the origin and evolution of sex. It's a fascinating book. He talks about abiogenesis, Luca, the origin of sex. He covers a lot of deep, very interesting topics. So,
yeah, because once you're at that stage, you can almost say that our hoity-toity multicellular metazoan critters that run around and make rocket ships are like a trivial foam on the beer genetically to what was developed over those early billions of years, where all the substrates of the cellular systems and neurological systems and sensory mechanics are coming about before we get to the flashy stuff that has a big fossil record.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, of life's 4 billion year history, 3.5 billion years of it are microbes.
Yeah.
So
and we have a tendency to avoid that issue because they're microscopic. You can't see them, even though they're everywhere. And as you well know too, you've expressed chagrin at how gobsmackingly varied all of those bacteria and protists are, and that a lot of that's only been discovered in just the last few years, where just when you think, well, now we got a grip, oh no, there's another
Oh
group.
heck no! I've been I was reading, um, I was metabolizing a whole bunch of technical literature on archaeans recently, and we've barely scratched the surface. We didn't even know archaeans existed until
Yeah.
was it the 1980s. So
Yeah, and so that's something literally within your lifetime, that whole revolution has come about. And I'm old enough to remember before that, which means in some respects, and I've said this in previous shows, I'm kind of glad I didn't take biology in high school or even in college, because I would have had to have unlearned so many of the things that were being taught based on the limited amount of information that they had available. So the fact that I started hitting the ground running on this in the 1980s and 90s, as this new information was just coming onto the field, I, in a way, grew up as an adult on homeobox genes that I wouldn't have had I stuck the biology I would have gotten in 1970 high school.
yeah, yeah, it's
And
it
I think that's a really fascinating phenomenon.
yeah, it expands ridiculously rapidly, which is why people have to specialize. If you go into a grad program, you have to specialize on something because there's so much data out there. They in high school and college, they're really giving you just kind of the basics of these fields. They're just introducing you to the topics.
Immutable as in code. Are we talking about standing for truth? We could be, in the sense that we're bumping into, in this chapter, you can co-op the book, functionally, and SFT has channeled Sanford and Tompkins and Jensen with a credulity that just makes you want to go, oh, you poor sweet little thing, you just believe everything you read, except for the stuff that's actually true. That, yeah, we're kind of bumping into all of that. The on the Rocks Were There book, that I'm currently finishing up. We decided to split that into two books, and so we hope to be able to get volume 1 out as a Christmas present for everybody. And everybody that you make a double feature. If you haven't already got Rocks Were There, then you can get or the Evolution Slam Dunk. You can get Rocks Were There too. They're both going to be a juicy book. It turns out, even though we're splitting it in half, there's enough overlap in terms of topics that I think it's going to work really effectively as a multiple volume. I still got to download and interpolate the material that you just did on listing all the animal phyla and their fossil record, and that'll be another appendix for the book. So we'll have some really nice meteorological and the phyletic end that will be really up to date in terms of information that you can use just as a reference point, in addition to all the stuff that's in the main text anyway. But I've been having a lot of fun with overthrusts. This is not a sexual thing. This is geology. And all of these fascinating bits of mega landslides. And there's quite a bit of creationist literature. Tim Clary goes run amok on some of these overthrusts that are in just fairly recent papers. And so I've been incorporating all of that in as well, so we can make sure that we're dropping anvils on all of their arguments down the line. And plus, I uncovered some just juicy crap from John Woodmarapp. He waves 9 of his own papers in 1993 that dated all the way back. I hadn't really realized how far back Woodmarapp has been. Never actually seen pictures of him, so I think he's probably as old as I am. Anyway, some of this stuff goes back into the 1970s and 80s, and it allows a bunch of material, including Woodmarapp shooting his mouth off on coral reefs and stuff that's also going to be figuring into the coral reef section. So we're going to be going after polystrate fossils and coral reefs and coal production, as well as Mount St. Helens and the Grand Canyon and all of their pseudogeology. It's a broad-ranging thing, and the delight is that both of us keep learning way more stuff in the course of investigating all of this, not because the creationists are accurate. It's because they keep on stumbling into areas that are really interesting. It turns out that there are some just unbelievably amazing landslides involved where a little itty bitty one with Mount St. Helens, a mere cubic mile of rock moved about 10 miles in about 10 minutes at speeds of 150 miles an hour at top speed, and then slammed into a mountain and slowed down a bit and then went down to the river. That's a teeny tiny little pimple eruption. That's Mount St. Helens. There are ones way bigger than that, where there are tens of cubic miles of land that have moved in matters of minutes in submarine landslides. Some of them involve gas hydrates. So a lot of this stuff is relating to the lubrication effect of gases and oil shales and other things that basically make things slippery so that you can move really massive pieces of real estate in relatively short paces of time. And they're not taking place underwater. I love it how none of the creationists bringing up these overthrusts explained how it got to be rock.
Well,
When
they
did
can't.
it get to be
Well, they
rock?
can't explain how.
Sometimes it's
Oh, I was gonna say. Well, they can't explain how lithification occurs in a few hundred years, anyways.
yeah.
Of these
Yeah,
mega
and
sediments.
I've never seen any of them even try. Yeah, that it's one thing to figure out how you could get all of this data up there, and then you've got those terrible problems, and we're going to be mentioning a lot of it in that chapter 7 about interbedded volcanic ash. Oh God, that's a mess for them, because every single bit of airborne ash means volcanoes that are above water. And how can you be above water when everything was by big slosh? How can you do that? And so they have to kind of alter. Woodmarap ties himself into knots where he'll flash to think that maybe some of the Carboniferous things were actually post-flood, and then maybe not, and then maybe again. So he has to constantly apologize for things and fall over his own argument, because there's no argument they can make. They can never create a consistent model.
That's true.
You can get cartoons. He indulges in cartoons and then kind of hand waving. But Woodmarap is particularly fun because he's one of these data spewers. He just has mammoth footnotes. You've encountered this, I'm sure, somewhat with Snelling and Tompkins and others, that their reference bibliographies are intimidating. If you start looking at them, you go, holy shit, they've got like hundreds of sources in here. Well, part of it involves tracking down litmus test items. I love Woodmarap at one point has got a thing where he has 200 out-of-place fossils. Wow, 200, of which only 2 are vertebrates. Both of those are from old Russian papers that you can't get online. You can't even get an abstract online. The title of one referred to, I think I mentioned it last week, was an extinct genus that I can't find anything on in any of the literature. It's that obscure. And the other one was a generic paper, but both of them involved the tertiary period. And so you've got a fossil that was known in the later tertiary that they find an earlier, or one from the early tertiary and find that it had lived on into the middle of the tertiary. This is it. So we found a slightly later tertiary beaver. I mean, wow. And so he thinks we're supposed to be impressed with all of this kind of stuff. It's terrible. Can't you find your Precambrian rabbit? Why can't you find the mixing of fossils would be ubiquitous in the fossil record if the flood had happened. You couldn't avoid it, particularly with marine animals. You can imagine some poor little enclave of critters living on a little hillside, and they're ecologically distinct, so the dinosaurs just down the way aren't interfering with the little nest of mammals. Somehow or other they smush. But marine animals swim, so there's nothing to prevent the whale from going into the next area where the plesiosaur is, and the marine turtle, and the mosasaur, and the anomalocarid, and all of this stuff. And there's not a single example anywhere on the planet where any of these things mush together, where modern teleosts are showing up with Cambrian marilla. No, never happens. And that's because they didn't all live at the same time.
Whoa, what a crazy explanation. It's almost like it didn't happen.
Exactly. And it's that of whenever you're encountering any young Earth creationists, you want to bring up that map of time issue, which is okay, what do you think happened? When do you think it happened? And on what basis? And you'll discover that although they may have a cartoon, like those vague little maps that Andrew Snelling puts up a map of the pre-flood world, and it's less detailed than Middle Earth or Narnia in terms of real estate, you immediately are suspicious. When you and you've been probably spotting an awful lot of the geology papers, when you see some of their paleo reconstructions where they're marking down where the fault zones are and the prevailing wind directions. I mean, it's just amazingly detailed stuff that they're
Oh yeah,
constructing meticulous paleoclimates.
yeah.
And in the interdisciplinary work, that's why you don't find that so much in older pre-tectonic papers. But once, that's another point that we're being a big point of with the new book is you got to remember when science was developed. So a lot of these overthrust papers that predate the 1970s, they didn't know about plate tectonics.
Well, heck, just
So
look at the geologic map of the United States.
oh, good heavens! Everybody, and it's not just the United States, everywhere. If you want to engage in young Earth creationist discussion, find out about the geology of where you live, because you are going to find the most fascinating tales.
That's what I did with my debate with Kent Hovind.
Jackson in Louisiana is in a very different environment than I am here in the Pacific Northwest in terms of the kind of rock formations that you find. If you talk to somebody in Kansas, they're standing on property, Cretaceous, and so all of these layers on things that they all have stories to tell. And I know there's like the I think the chronic. I'll type that into the live feed here. I think they're spelled chronic with a CHR.
CHR, yeah.
There are these roadside guides. Yeah, there are all these roadside guides, and I haven't looked in the bookstores lately, but they used to be all over the place that you can buy that are driving tours for your state. And you can actually see, and they describe the geology of the area and what dates rocks are and all that, because they've done that stuff. Find out if there's any local geology clubs in your area and the meetings that they do. You'll be intimidated by how snarky and shop talky the geologists will be, but nevertheless, they can be extremely useful. Same thing for biology or any other areas, whatever discipline you're fascinated in. If you're in an area where you're into astronomy and cosmology and you're near Kitt Peak or astronomy groups like that, connect up with that. There's a bunch of different venues that you can build on your own interest in things and then use that direct knowledge to apply when you start analyzing anti-evolution stuff. And if you're talking about the cosmology and the geology stuff, you're bumping into younger creationists then. If you're bringing into biology and that, and now you're also dragging in the old Earth creationists and the intelligent designers because they have a more restricted data field. But it's all the different ways of doing it. Let's see, that's BJ says this is why she doesn't get the people who come from Australia preach YEC when Evo and the geology is so obvious in Australia. Ooh, but who says they study the geology? Yeah, Andrew Snelling is from Australia and New Zealand, I think, in particular. And when you look at his stuff, he bumped into just a limited number of geological deposits. And that he is just stuck with those like cuddle blankets, where often the material is from the 19th century, old books that he's drawn on. And what's fascinating is to see how he doesn't seem to want to engage with newer material except very, very selectively. So I think there was a deposit down that they did one of these videos. I can't remember who did a criticism of it. It might have been Bill Ludlow. That happened to be about Snelling was being quoted about this particular bay area that was gravel. Well, I looked the damn thing up, and it's characteristic gravel of tidal inlets. You can see exactly that kind of distribution, and so it was patently obvious. No, this was once a tidal inlet, and it has all the exact characteristics of it. And when you try to look up Snelling on it, his old stuff from the 1990s was drawing on stuff in the 1850s, and he's done nothing on it since. He just refers back to his old material, and he's paid no attention to recent geology material. I can't believe he isn't aware of some of this stuff, but yet it doesn't show up in his material. That's
Uh,
always suspicious.
well, I mean, we say we can't believe he's not aware of it, but is he not aware of it? It's like,
Yeah.
I mean,
And
is
it,
Georgia
there,
Purdom not aware of
yeah.
the relevant genetic literature?
And so here's why I think it has to do with almost the brain operating before conscious level. That there's that Tortucan component to the brain. This is the one I'd love to have cognitive. If there's any cognitive people out there that do MRI studies, please get in touch. I'd love to be able to test this out. But my hypothesis here is that that Tortucan mind shell aspect is acting like a carapace. And, and it's also a kind of subconscious monitor to where if Snelling is reading a technical paper and there's information in there that's a problem for his model, a portion of his brain is going, oh, no, no, oh, no, that's not going to make you happy. No, 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 no. There, go over to that. That's, oh, this paragraph is an authority quote. This is much better. There, that feels better. And I think that is actually going on down in the pre-filter era, so that they're not lying in the sense of suppressing information, because the fascinating people for me are the ones in the anti-evolution movement who are really not stupid. Philip Johnson got into Harvard when he was 16. The man is not a dunce. And yet you can see his brain shutting off when you look at topics that are like bird evolution, where he's just relying on somebody secondhand and then not thinking much about it afterwards. And again, Snelling, who somehow doesn't think to investigate the new material. You think if you if you move a little bit away from the creationist frame to someone like Alan Fiducia engages on a lot of that contrary information. He's operating at a direct level. He's mangling and being peculiar at a lot of it, but he's engaging with it. But it's the parts where you see the diehard creationist and anti-evolutionist where their brain just doesn't get there. And they go back to tropes, they go back to the things they're familiar dealing with. And you can see that that's one advantage of seeing lots of creationism. And as you've discovered helping writing this book with me, holy moly, is there a lot of repetition. That the same modes are trotted out chapter after chapter after chapter, where you're saying, well, we've already dealt with that.
I think the best example of that is Gary Parker's chapter, where he literally had only a single paragraph that was novel information. Well, novel.
Yeah.
That was it. The entire thing is like 6 or 7 pages was all just rehash of tropes we'd already covered. There was nothing new.
Oh, Brian brings up, says, I found that Tortucans to a person have lack of scale in common with flurfers. Go figure. Oh, I don't have to figure it all. When you're looking at a flat earther, you're looking at the extreme Tortucan nexus. But what Philip Johnson and Andrew Snelling and Dwayne Gish and all these doing in their frame is, from a methods point of view, no different. They're relying on an extremely limited data field. They have non-negotiable dogmas that they scavenge around for data blips to present. It's one of the reasons why lawyers often make really good creationists, because they're used to defending a client, and their client is now God, and they can use whatever rhetorical tricks necessary to make a good case that the independent jury reading all of this will be impressed with, so they can get a conviction of Satan. I mean, that's kind of boiling it down into a nutshell. And you find that popping up there, but it's the same methodology, that the less you are that ideologue and the more you get into the normal science realm, you get up to the point of where somebody like a Stephen Hawking, who says, okay, here's my model and here's your modifier, and I'll bet you a Playboy year of subscription is right or wrong on this. And then the new evidence comes in and he goes, well, I have to pay up. I was wrong. There it is. And that's because you let the chips where they may. That's the train. It's not that you're devoid of hypothesis, things you have a serious conviction on. It's that you know when you've lost. It's that you recognize when the data just doesn't support your argument. And even though you loved it so much, you just have to jettison it and move on to something different. And that's the difference between the scientist and the ideologue. And you have a spectrum of behavior that goes on to where you have bullheaded scientists that have low-level Tortugan traits, and then you've got extreme ideologues who have capital T Tortugan traits, and we go overboard on it. Let me put up my brief pause to thank all of our patrons, since I can't do the thing visually. Everybody that helped out in the project, there's a link to the GoFundMe and also to the Patreon account. And if every little bit helps, the more people, the merrier. And at the moment, we have our colleagues Hendril and Eric and Suris, and our research me and Eat Meal and Ralph and Pelagia and Benjamin Simpson and Ugly German Truths, and assistant researchers Mike Apple and Duranku and James Fitzwater and Totis Real, and our friends Daniel and Steve Bauman and Marigale Beddoes and Insects Are Cool and Morton Nielsen and Puffalophagus and Bo Hobo and Staggles and Alex and Paul. And I still will thank the legacy patrons, people who were able to help for a while, but the circumstances changed for them. Jan and Jody and John and Keith and Andrew and Dyer and Yui and Mona and Brad and Daniel and Yana and Sun, Sky, Stone and Everett and Sewer and Zeshi, every one of you. I thank you all over the place for all the help you can do, and keep spreading the word. If you think that it was important enough to support me with $1 a month or whatever, let your networks know about that and say, hey, if you think this is important too, help out, because I'd like to hope that someday I will have as many patrons as often flat earthers do. I think I'm at least as valuable as that.
At the very least, you're right. So there's that.
Yeah. I'll put a little bit to remind everybody. It says there's the Nobrega paper and the other paper in there from the early 2000s on gene deserts and how that connected up to stuff. And take a look at his speech, because it's a really fast thing to do. It's not it's just the slides and all there, because it really sums up very nicely about the issues about how genetics worked and the junk DNA, and why, yes, there is some junk DNA. Not everything is functional with the genome. Now, the other half of the show is our gift that keeps on giving, Denise O'Leary from the Canadian Intelligent Design Branch. And she went on, as usual, riffing off of secondary sources. This one had to do with the evolutionary history of stick and leaf insects. And good old Denise tweeted back on the 8th that stick insects, remarkable camouflage, post-dates mammals and birds. There was not as much time as was thought for the Darwinian claims linking to what is like, and then she linked to what was her post there at Uncommon Descent. Almost all of Uncommon Descent stuff is anonymous.
Is she aware that
there's enough involved?
Is she aware that 160 million years post-dates birds and mammals?
She doesn't have much chronology issues.
I mean,
here.
That's
anyway,
that's kind of low bar to set. So.
Yeah, this is another bit where they're like grasping at straws. That is it really that big of a deal? Well, fortunately, the paper is open access, and it is just a juicy little thing. Sabrina Simon and a whole bunch of other collaborators, Old World and New World Phasmatoidea, phylogenomics resolve the evolutionary history of stick and leaf insects. It sounds like they're not thinking there's a problem here, because they're resolving the issues, and it's got detailed phylogenies, including biogeographical information about which kinds of sticky insects are found in particular areas. So it's the case that some that were thought just on morphological grounds to be maybe related were just convergence. And they were able to break all of this down in greater detail. Well, the data is there, and you're going to have to account for it. And Denise O'Leary is just an example of this hit and run bit that I find so annoying with people, that especially if they riff off of the secondary accounts. They're trawling around for problems. But the problem with that is every time you link to a secondary account of a technical paper, that opens the doorway to that technical information, and you need to account for it. If you have a model, fine. If you've got an intelligent design model, tell us what it is. Dragoon damn Gunter Beckley in from the insect field and tell us how many are there created kinds? Is everything still related by common descent, but God meddles every once in a while because he has a fondness for stick insects? I mean, what exactly is going on here? Have a model and ideally put it out for a test. The biogeographical matter is an area that is a horrifying problem for anti-evolutionists in general. It's a catastrophe for creationists who are trying to scrunch everything down into too tight of a time frame, but it's still a big problem for anti-evolutionists in any form, because you have to explain why particular things are found where they are. Sometimes there are puzzles as to how did this thing get way over there on this isolated island. But the naturalistic mind says, you know, there's got to be an explanation. Let's keep at it until we can figure out
Just
what it
think
was.
of the Wara, the little the Falkland Islands wolf. There were questions back in Darwin's day about why it was on the Falklands Islands. How did it get there? It couldn't have just
Yeah.
swum across. It turns out that the land, the island was, if not connected, was a lot closer to Antarctica, and there are these shelves South America, and
Yeah.
the Falkland Islands back in the Pleistocene. So, turns out there was a way.
Yeah. Yeah. And so that you have to deal with paleoclimates. The farther back you go, the deeper the divergence is. Now you have to pay attention to the paleo configuration 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 80, 100 million years ago for some of these things. And so you can just see the typical low-level anti-evolutionists, their brain suddenly starting to leak pus because they got way too much information that they have to accommodate. So they just trance on back to the cartoon and the tweet, and they think they can resolve it that way.
Indeed.
Yeah, it's no coincidence that insects. By the way, the lecture on ENCODE also mentioned the fact that it offered flies as an example, that selection pressure is different for populations that have very rapid replication times and extremely large populations. And it's the reason why human beings, that although today we have quite large populations, this wasn't always the case, but we also have relatively slow replication times. And then another example that he offered were elephants that have a really slow replication time.
You're talking about our selection versus K selection, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, you've got the multiple levels. Explain that to the audience, the difference between R and K selection.
Let me see if I remember exactly. So our selection, I might be getting these backwards, but it's one or the other. So either way, I think it's our selection is where you have a lot of babies, where you don't spend a lot of resources on them because there's a high possibility a bunch of them are going to die. Whereas K selection is you have a few offspring and you put a lot of energy into them because there's a high probability they're going to survive. And so,
the difference between where you have a relatively few offspring that you've got to really pay attention to, and that's another factor as to how parental you are. A lot of these animals that have huge amounts of offspring, basically they replicate and then they go away. And okay, you're on your own, kids. When you hatch, have fun. You'll never see us. And so there's a totally different dynamic on that. And those are yet more a level. I've mentioned before the idea, everyone who has a map of time in their head should envisage everything that's alive on Earth right now as a time slice. So you think of every animal, and each animal is a population of organisms, and each individual organism has a genome, and it has gut microbia, and it has parasitical things going on, and there's animals that are going to try to eat it, and it wants to eat. That's going on in an environment where there is an ecological framework that can be altered by climate shifts from the wobbling axis and tectonic movements and all that over extremely long time frames. That's a time slice. And there are as many time slices as you want to deal with all the way back through the beginning of life, and will continue on definitely. So whenever you see a fossil that's in a book, it's a blip in a giant time slice where a lot of the pieces are missing. But it would have been just as intricate an interaction in that time slice if you went back in a time machine. And any model of life that doesn't address all of that complexity in dealing with the model is missing the point, because what you actually have are a series of time slices as populations shift over time. Now, if you want to imagine that there's a designer that pops in and meddles in some way, go ahead, explain what it is. Meddling in what way? Going down into the genomes of individual organisms and going, okay, I'm going to make that A into a T here because I know down the road that's going to lead to the thing that I want to, because I have an impending goal in mind and I'm really patient, so I can take 200 million years to do it. Or are they just creating poof? This is a more of a problem for the created kind model. Even creationists, the young Earth creationists, in a way, gets them off the hook because they imagine that the created kinds are made in one go. So there's an empty Garden of Eden, and then poof, 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 poof. There are the created heterozygosity kind critters. And then they all go off on their own little way and they can hyperspeciate and do all the fun little things. And then human beings sin. And so God destroys all of them except for the ones that are on the ark and don't bother about the insects and the marine animals. And then this process continues again. No creationists that I know of, and if there are any that do this, let me know, because I think it'd be a fun thing to find out. Is there any creationist that actually imagines over time there being like an empty field, and then zot, there is a field of wildebeest complete with internal parasites and all the different genome variations in there in one fell swoop? I mean, a god could do that just as easily as creating the initial thing. So there's an infinite range, in the same way that every once in a while they find new phyla. Is it because we just discovered them? Or did God just do a new zot because they've run out of, oh, I haven't made a phylum in like ever so long. I think I need to make a new one now.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's
they don't think about that, but yet they would need to.
It is curious. Yeah, I was as I was doing the research on that one, it's weird that the rotifers don't go past the Eocene in fossils. You know, they were probably out there for a long time, but they're just not in the fossils past then. Same with nematodes.
Don't have a fossil record for them.
Nematodes don't have a fossil record past the Jurassic. So,
see, that's why that's another one. If any creationist tries to bring up the fossil record and say, "Oh, the animal phyla were present in the Cambrian," the only people who can say that with a straight face are creationists, because they have the advantage of biological and genetic information to where they can say, "Okay, here are some groups that on evolutionary grounds are really basal, diverging phyla, and since we find their cousins that are later animals in the fossil record, they would have been there too, even though we don't find any direct references for it." But if you're stuck with just the fossil record to go on, you have holes in the number of phyla that you can trace back that far in time. And so any creationist that's trying to wave phyla at us had better jolly well pay better attention and stop relying on Steve Meyer.
Oh yeah, because he's not a biologist or a paleontologist. He has no background in this field except like a little geology. He has a little geology
and no map of time curiosity. He doesn't have any more of a map of time in his head, and everyone either should have a map in time of their head, or if they have pus leaking out of their ears because they don't want to think about it, then study this, because if you can't conceptualize those layers of time in the past, you're never going to be able to get a grip on all of that stuff. You can find elements of it in any work where there are really good reconstructions of paleo environment, good illustrations of things. This has been true for really good books. The new Irwin and Valentine book has some wonderful illustrations and stuff in there on the Cambrian. You find typically dinosaur books go up the yin yang for really neat depictions of the spot where the dinosaur actually lived, like what the Solnhofen was like when the Archaeopteryx was into that anoxic length. And you can find that all over the place. There's more and more of that going on in more recent paleontology, because it's not just do a pretty picture. It's trying to meticulously reflect everything can find, even down to were mountains off in the horizon or not, and what kind of mountains they were, and on what basis could you figure all that out. So the art form of paleontological illustration is at a high level today compared to what it was when I was growing up. And so you can grab onto books that are like that. Um, Haunt your local library and plow through, find the material. And then the other aspect is don't be afraid of the technical literature. At the most, your eyes will glaze over at the terminology, but so what? You can download things where it's got an, you realize part of the thing is the realization when something is really interesting, even if you don't necessarily understand all the ins and outs, you know it's an important work. It's about a thing that's filling in your map of time. And you can download if it's available as a PDF and keep it stored away and poke into it every once in a while. You know, if people can do video games in installments and finger away for hours and hours on that, you can do the same thing with this. Treat a technical paper like a weird video game where in order to be able to kill the monsters, you're going to have to figure out what specialized terminology are, and then you can find the secret doorway to the references where you can start finding out, ooh, here is the secret code that turns out to actually mean stuff when you unthink. Think of it as a game.
And sometimes,
And
oh, sorry, I was gonna say sometimes that with really technical papers, they will often define terminology in the margins. So, you know.
yeah, especially review articles. I mentioned this. Oh, hi, Michelle. Good evening. She's late to come in. There's a whole bit of the annual reviews of genetics and of this and that and thus and such that are written for technical audiences, but they are a review of the field. Another area that you can get at for a lower level introduction, things like Scientific American, where typically their main articles are written by not merely science journalists, but usually people that are kind of expert in the areas, and they're giving a summary discussion of what their field is. Oh, Michelle, thank you. These discussions are always so interesting. I hope not to bore anybody on there, and I hope everybody catches the science bug. This is fun. I've always been fascinated with dinosaurs and a lot of other creatures on things, and I am like a kid in a candy store. It's exhausting, but there is so much information available that it just drives me nuts sometimes. I'll get the next video script from Jackson, and oh God, there's more sources. No, I gotta find that out, and I have to follow those things up because I'm curious about it. There was just a wonderful video by Shannon, Pelagia's Squeeze, where she was doing a wonderful program on why religion is not a yes, it's the main squeeze. Why religion is not a psychopathology, and why it's a misnomer to do that.
It was a very good video.
All sort of heat from various atheists who were complaining about it. Yeah. Very good video. Yeah, and there were some technical papers in it that I had to look up, and I downloaded, and they are being put into an aside of a certain project that is remaining over in the corner.
Very interesting.
So that those things will be dealt with as well, because it all involves about the deep issues of why people have beliefs at all, and to what extent is religion an unusual belief system or just an application of the fact that we believe stuff, and to what extent can it go awry, and what are the circumstances that produce that? Because sometimes we all know that some religions can get wacky, and I put up as a commentary in the video that for me the salient is any religion or politics gets the ability to persecute you for mere belief and can enforce its orthodoxy at the point of a gun, that's going to run off the rails. And that's what happened with the Inquisition. It happens with the Taliban and ISIS. It happens with the Soviet Union. It's what goes on in North Korea. That it's that the ability to enforce orthodoxy that's the dynamic, not whether you believe in sky gods or no gods at all. That's not the salient variable. And I think that's an important issue to where, excuse me, but religions can inspire great creativity. I mean, Bach, his music, painters, arts, architecture, even bloody tarot cards can be the fabulous artwork in tarot cards. It's claptrap. It's silly occultism, but you can get some pretty pictures out of it. So, you know, all sorts of people are inspired to do all sorts of interesting things in a variety of ways. And we minimize the range of human creativity when we think, oh, that's off limits. We don't worry about that. And Morton says, boring never. We need more books. And there are so many ways of getting to information nowadays. And the more that you can ground yourself in those primary sources, that's when it becomes really neat. First of all, it's a cheap thing to do. If you have to spend your money on books all the time, you have to have a ton of money on that. But boy, you can get the information the books relied on for free in one place or another by reading the original technical material. And so if you're a impoverished Social Security guy like me, heck, this is happy land, because you can gain access to information on a level that would just make people fall apart with envy. Imagine if Darwin had access to the internet. Can you imagine what that guy would have done if he didn't have to worry about writing letters off to people and hoping and trying to find some little blip of things and trying to see who, and people would have to send him physical copies of things when he could just download the PDFs all the time. Wow.
I mean,
and
with
how many...
with letters alone, he wrote 200 plus pages Origin, and then like 500 plus pages Descent of Man. So look at what he did accomplish, and then extrapolate further.
Yeah. I mean, I can admire enormously his diligence and curiosity, and be frustrated at the limitations of it. Another one who is one that would just be gobsmacked. I'm thinking two people right off the bat who would just be in seventh heaven if they lived today. Alexander von Humboldt, who everybody at the time, including Darwin and since, just admires the bejabbers out of. God, he was an amazingly observant naturalist. And then another would be Benjamin Franklin. Not only would he be scavenging the science literature, but he would be on every dating site you could possibly imagine, hunting up chicks.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah. Well, Morton Nielsen says, talking about books for me. I have no problem. I can be shameless promoter on that. And if you like fiction, get a creationist book, or get my Paralogues of Phileas Fogg.
It'll be more entertaining to get your book, RJ.
Indeed, and it'll be historically accurate at the very least. So
there you go.
And I'm still plowing along with the about 2/3 of the way through the new Paralogues of Fogg novel. That probably won't come out until after the new year, because I want to focus full bore on getting the first Rocks Are There volume out, which is just I'm just stoked for this new little bit, because it is we're striking out into so much area. This is not a retread of a lot of other people's material. We have dived into primary source material on a level that I think surpasses every competitor.
I think,
and we can be proud.
You're right, RJ. This will be the first of the two most comprehensive.
Annoy an awful lot of creation.
Yeah, this will be these two will be the most comprehensive books on creationism to date.
Yeah, and it'll be fully referenced and indexed, so that you'll be able to find your way around through particular things. So if you're debating with any creationist and they bring up anybody like Ron Wyatt or oddball names, and that, you can check to find out what Jackson and RJ had to say. Oh, there we go. So like that, and find information on it. And it's all thoroughly documented at a variety of levels. There's some things that we're bringing out that are YouTube lectures that are very useful, and that can open up the window on it. And the subterranean thing is, we're displaying how source methods look. We're showing that, okay, here's the person's claim, and here's what they thought to document it with, and here's what that documentation actually looks like, and here's the information they left out, and here's why they is a different species of human. What is the basic requirement to classify a species? The ability to produce fertile offspring. That's a part, yeah. The blood type thing, Rh negative blood, definitely not as a separate species. In fact, how incompatible is Rh negative with other ones?
I'm not familiar, but if you try swapping internal fluid or organs with other people and it doesn't match up, you will die. So
yeah, how does the sexual recombination? That's actually an interesting question. How does sexual recombination compensate for that kind of a thing? Is it partly a matter that since you're getting your system from one parent or another, by definition, you'll always have a viable system independent of it because it's only getting one parent, right?
I, well, I mean, with when you're when the gametes fuse to form a zygote, the mother's body has to develop a system so that it doesn't terminate the zygote automatically because it is detecting like different. This is a foreign body, you know.
Yeah, and it has to do that in any case because there's been some argument that mammalian placental system is one where you have to produce a series of barriers to keep the mother's body from killing the baby
Right.
as a foreign invader. So, and the baby gets into this little tug of war with the mother as to, I'm sucking nutrients off you, but don't try to think of me as like something you want to get the immune system going on. So let's kind of tone that down, okay, until I'm out of here. Until
Yeah.
you're out of the rental property.
I think for blood compatibility, I mean, it's you're not really worrying about it at like a genetic or in the case of gametes because you're just trading genes, but
Yeah, because otherwise I think people would be dropping dead more often, and,
well, yeah,
and
because it's about
isolated blood forms would have been weeded out by now.
yeah, it's your
So
proteins.
must be a compensatory mechanism on it. That's a good question.
Yeah, it's the proteins in the blood which are causing you to have problems because you're not recognizing them. I actually did just read a paper earlier today on histocompatibility in tunicates, which was fascinating. So there's that.
Which is really at the base of the chordate bunch. Those, but they're hemichordates, or what are they classified as?
What tunicates?
Tunicates.
Oh, they're chordates. Yeah, they're the second because you have lanceolets, which are first, and then you have tunicates just up from that, closer to us.
For those who don't not aware of what a tunicate is, it looks as an adult form like a transparent little bag that goes like this. And in its larval form, it betrays its chordate relationships, which they were just kind of working out when I was coming into the field, and now it's like, duh. Even Jonathan Wells technically puts the tunicates in the chordate bunch in his Icons of Evolution, back in the notes. I don't think he realizes the concession that he's just done, but it's funky because they have the normal complement of brain and system. And I always loved the thing, I can't remember her name, but I quoted it in the old tip book where he said that she said that when it settles down and becomes a sessile organism, it eats its own brain like an associate professor tenure. And I really love that snark on there, but that shows you something that you have to be very careful in looking at the adult forms of things. And that's why so much of what led to evolutionary thinking involved seeing the embryos of things, and now the genetics of that, to where just because something ends up this way as an adult doesn't mean it doesn't have a whole bunch of stuff that's going on earlier in its developmental biology that's telling you the reason why it's doing that is because it's on this part of that evolutionary lineage. And the technical literature on all of that stuff, every time I see some new paper on Amphioxus and lanceolets, and then even better when you start looking at the gene systems involved, whenever there's some the choanoflagellates, all those are just ooh, and ALUs, that's my favorite go-to example of a genetic component what everybody wants to do. I have my own set, and Jackson, I'm sure, has his own set, and everybody can come up with things that you know quite well at a technical level that are litmus test items that are particularly useful to act as either trapdoors or anvils when dealing with anti-evolutionists or whatever woo group that you're dealing with. And so people that are going after flat earthers are going to have a different set than somebody that's going after a younger creationist who's talking flood geology, and a different set when you're dealing with somebody who's an anti-evolutionist claiming that nothing is related by common descent. But you can all come up with your own little sets on that. And the more that you can make it your own personal knowledge, because you know the rocks, because that's the stuff in your neighborhood, you know the genetics because you know in your own family, or like the matter of that the blood type thing, which brings up an interesting thing. So I'll ask anybody watching, or anybody that knows anybody that's watching, or whatever, if you got some neat technical work on what goes on in the compatibility system in relation to why the particular blood groups have been sustained. I may very well have some technical literature buried on in
Well,
my
they've
references, and I
probably,
would have to go hunting around for blood types or R.
I would imagine they probably don't have any particular selective pressures for or against any of them in particular.
Ooh, Old Scratch brings up a science fiction thing, which is Halloween themed. If a fly gets into a teleporter with you and your genome's refused, would you really turn into a Brendel fly? I think you would turn into a blob of nothing that does not function at all. Because if you think about what mixing would happen here, it makes for a cute story. The original, The Fly, with the guy with the bug head, and yet his brain is still thinking of himself as a person, but he's got a fly head. And then he's also got the fly, his little shrunken head on a fly who's still able to go, help me. That's probably preposterous. That even if you were just intermingling, you would just end up with what, a mass of cell tissues and stuff. It would be a complete mess. So you would not end up with a viable organism at either end. But yet you get, it makes for fun stories, and it can be an amusing thing to figure with. I think the major, far worse than the fly and the guy getting into the teleporter and being intermingled, is the teleporter. That I don't know how a teleporter can work. It may be theoretically possible, but it's one of those things that for Star Trek, whenever I see them beaming down, it's nice, it's useful for the plot, but I think I also put a little flash up, this is probably impossible, but it makes a nice story.
Yeah.
Oh, Michelle put up, or Brian put up some stuff, Science Direct links. I'll have to blob into those and take a look at those in due course. See what happens. There's so much information out there, and some of it may very well be in my own reference field and others not. I still have big stacks of incoming technical information that haven't been put in to the reference field because I'm too busy working on the books and all the other stuff. There's a flood of information. You want to have a sense of how that is. Just walk into a college library and casually flip through the table of contents of every science journal you see. And if it suddenly realizes why it's really difficult to keep up with all the incoming material. So I put a lot of the stuff on my triage that I'll plow through in later points, and I can plug those into the data field. But every once in a while, there was a thing where Jackson was referring to a technical paper there, and I suddenly go, oh, yeah, that's that brand new one in PNAS. So I have to go to the PNAS style, pull out the thing, and then plug it into the thing so that I would have that up to speed on the technical literature. Because the goal is that all the really relevant stuff that I need to deal with when I'm interacting with wooists are in my data field in the reference base. And that makes it easier to acquire and locate information. So if somebody brings up a particular subject or a particular website or a particular writer, I can hunt through and find out about them and get a context for it really rapidly. But I can't do that if it's not in the reference bibliography. And then the other end of it is the spreadsheet aspect, where I'm measuring source by source by source by source every bloody instance of an anti-evolutionist drawing on technical literature to get at measurement that nobody has ever done before. So, plug for my work. In addition to writing fabulously entertaining science works and delightfully entertaining historical science fiction, fantasy, and mystery novels, also, I'm doing the tip work, which is measuring source by source that whole range of how much of this data field do anti-evolutionists really bump into. Nobody's measured this before. There's no place you can go to find this except me. And I'd like, ideally, that somebody will pick up the work eventually later on and keep at that, because it gives you a breakdown, and people in principle would then be able to take that information and break it down even more into subcategories and look to see how particular subtopics are dealt with by anti-evolutionists based upon the information that I've accumulated. At the moment, it's about 60,000 references that include about 27,000 technical papers and another 10,000 general science work and about 9,000 plus anti-evolution works. That's not a trivial amount of stuff. And I will keep at it as long as I can, which is another reason why I need like ink and paper in addition to food and pay for, bills. So everybody that can help out at the GoFundMe or at the Patreon thing or buying the books and telling people about it, even if you can't plop down any money, Tell people about it because maybe they. So there's my can rattle, and I think we've pretty much gone on that point for today. Next week, I think I have on the peg for the second topic that what if scenario thing that I brought up a couple weeks ago. That's an intriguing bit that sounds like a pointless game. What if you replayed the tape of life? That's Stephen Jay Gould's famous analogy. What if there were B-52s at the Battle of Gettysburg? That in fact, for history and science, it's actually a really fascinating thought experiment game. Which because the ones who thought of what if dinosaurs hadn't died out, or what if human beings disappeared, and what would happen then? You have to understand how things work, and you have to take a stand to apply your understanding of how economic systems function, how social systems, what's the role of the individual for historical subjects, or how do interactions work, what the selection pressures, what is the evolvability. You have to really put your thinking cap on to speculate. And the speculations may be better or worse, but that very interaction can be fantastically useful. So that'll be a little side topic that we can deal with in the next week. And then I still keep on putting references. I've got stuff out to December in terms of the secondary topics. And then, of course, we're continuing to analyze the genetics of the creationist book. So, yes, T.D. Lane said maybe the Romans wouldn't have collapsed if they had had MiG-42s. Yeah, and that goes into the whole bit. There's a shameless plug for Paralogs of Fog, because in it, I'm pondering if people actually knew about atomic energy back in the 19th century, what could be done about it and what shouldn't be done about it? And that's actually a little side issue that relates to like 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea and the movie version of 20,000 Leagues and the movie version of From the Earth to the Moon. There were even some stories, I think back in the 70s, I think I read a novel, Victoria Ball, which did a fascinating speculative thing about somebody having an atomic bomb at Crimea and how that does or does not work out. But anyway, we go on. Have a happy Halloween. It's going to be cold as bejabbers here, so we're probably not going to get too many kids. It's only going to be freezing here. We're getting a cold front from the Arctic that's making it very cold. It was like 16 degrees yesterday here at night, and getting up to a brisk, not quite freezing during the day, which is unusually cold for us. But that's pumping cold air south, which when it hits California turns into dry air and winds. Is the reason why they got such severe fires going on in there. So that you can see how climate change, it's warming the ocean up and altering the jet stream and changing what the cold fronts are doing, has an effect for people's houses burning 1,000 miles from where I am. So that's how things connect up. So boo to you all, BJ. And we try to rock, and the rocks are still there.